Give me a second. I have to take care of one matter. Okay, so let's. Um, I'm going to present a chart. I'm just going to put it onto the screen so I can go over it with you. Okay, euthanasia. So I'm just going to go through these two sheets. We have euthanasia, some notes, and then some cases. Okay. So I want to go through the teachings of the church. It comes from the understanding of the principle of double effect, but I'm not going to refer back to the principle of double effect. I'm just going to look at the different kinds of euthanasia and then try to figure out certain situations, whether it is justified or not justified according to Catholic ethical teachings. So there's two kinds of euthanasia. The first one's called active euthanasia, and the second one's called passive euthanasia. So these sheets are in your email as attachments, I believe, and if not, they're in your package towards the end of your package. So active euthanasia, this refers to death by commission. This is a death of a patient that is caused by a lethal action of another. For example, giving the patient an overdose of morphine. This is what my mother-in-law went through last year. She was in palliative care. We'll talk about palliative care in a while. And she had congenital heart failure. And rather than keep her at the hospital, they brought her home. And she couldn't eat anymore, so she was being fed through her tube in her stomach, because every time she ate or drank something, it would fill up her lungs, and that would cause her a lot more problems. So I had to bypass all that. She was undergoing a lot of medication, as well as undergoing oxygen. And we knew that her life was coming to the end, and the last couple of months was really hard. Um, she started taking medication, small dosages of morphine, but at the end, what happened to her was we gone to visit her. We're on our way home, my wife and I, and we got a phone call about 20 minutes after we left on a Sunday evening, and they told us to come back, and we came back. She had had two strokes, and I share this as a personal experience just to show you um, um, situations people find themselves in. Um, the two strokes had left her almost totally um, incapacitated. And so they had to increase the morphine, and then she died about a day later. But this is at euthanasia. This is not what happened here. This is the morphine was to deal with the pain. Some people believe um, that you should actively do something to end a person's life, and so giving a patient an overdose of morphine, too much morphine, can cause death. Shooting a patient. This is similar to shooting a horse that has a couple broken legs. It's often referred to as mercy killing. You put it out as misery, and you show mercy to it. So you love them by killing them. It's a contradiction, an oxymoron. But shooting a patient is an active form of euthanasia because you're actually doing something. Suffocation, putting a pillow over someone's head and killing them that way. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The most famous case in Canada is Robert Latimer, who had a severely disabled, physically disabled, mentally disabled daughter. Um, Daughter had undergone numerous operations, and every operation left her less and less mobile, less and less free and capable. So he decided to take the matters in his own hand. He put his daughter in his car in the garage, took the exhaust, a tube in the exhaust, and filled the interior of the car with carbon monoxide. That's the gas that comes out of the car, and killed his daughter. He was found guilty of manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in jail. I will talk more about Robert Latimer in the next couple of days. A lethal cocktail, especially Dr. Kevorkian in the States, would put a bunch of chemicals together, and either he would end a person's life or get them to push a button that would end their own lives. So that's active euthanasia. Uh, Passive euthanasia, this refers to death by omission. So commission and omission. Commission, you actually do something, and omission means you omit or you fail to give people a duty of care. Death is the result of the withdrawing of treatment, for example, shutting off a respirator. So someone is really sick in a hospital, and they need a respirator to live and to survive, and you turn it off. Now, the actual turning it off is actually an action, but by not providing the duty of care, you're omitting to provide it, and therefore not providing them the respirator, the use of the respirator. So that omission is what we call passive euthanasia. Withholding life-saving surgery. So if you need an operation and they decide it's not worth it or it's not economical, not efficient, and not giving them the life-saving surgery, excuse me, results in the death of the other person. So withholding the surgery is a way of doing passive euthanasia. Because if they had the surgery, perhaps they would have been healthier or lived longer. Removing the feeding tube. Again, like my mother-in-law, she was being fed with a tube in her stomach. The most famous case here is Mary Schiavo in, I believe it's Florida, where she was in a coma being fed intravenously through the stomach through a feeding tube. And the courts decided um, that the hospital should remove the feeding tube because they considered her to be brain dead and having suffered a severe stroke. The family objected, but the court removed the tube, expecting her to die. Unfortunately, I think she lived about 2 or 3 weeks later. The end result of removing the feeding tube is she's not being fed. So in essence, what happened here is by not giving her the duty of care of nutrition, of feeding her, they basically starved her to death. Okay, so now, active euthanasia, according to the Catholic ethical teachings, is never justified. It is always the adoption of a proposal that includes the death of the patient. So if you actively do something that causes the death of a person, then you are committing a bad action. In other words, it always involves positively willing the death of the patient. So you intend to kill the person. Okay. As such, the action is murderous. So in Catholic moral teaching, following from the principle of double fact, it's a bad action with a bad intention. Okay. And all the other pieces will come together. Now, passive euthanasia, on the other hand, can be justified at times. But before we know when it is justified, we have to become familiar with a further distinction, extraordinary and ordinary treatment. So some passive euthanasia is acceptable in Catholic moral teaching and some are not. So we have to first decide what is the difference between ordinary treatment and extraordinary treatment. So ordinary treatment is any medical treatment that is not a serious burden on the patient, either financially or physically or emotionally or psychologically, etc. Extraordinary treatment is any medical treatment that is a serious burden on the patient, either financially or physically or emotionally or psychologically, etc. Essentially, one is not obligated to use extraordinary treatment to preserve a person's life, but one is obligated to use ordinary treatment to preserve human life. The reason is the following. If the treatment is ordinary, then the treatment is not a serious burden on the patient. So there is no reason to remove the treatment. If a person removes it, it is not because the treatment was seriously burdensome, otherwise it would be extraordinary treatment, but rather that life was considered a burden in some way, either by oneself or by someone else. In other words, removing ordinary treatment amounts to a direct killing or intentional killing. One is adopting a proposal that includes the death of the patient. But when, and I'll explain it further, let me just go through the notes and we'll talk about it. Okay? But when extraordinary treatment is removed, it is not necessarily murderous. If the treatment is a serious burden on the patient in one of the aforementioned ways, one may refuse to consent to it. If a doctor should tell you that you have 6 months to live, but with a treatment that has very painful side effects, you can live for an extra 2 years, you do not necessarily have an obligation to consent to it. If the treatment is a serious financial burden on your family, you do not necessarily have a duty to consent to it. If the treatment is seriously emotionally repugnant, you are not necessarily acting with murderous intent should you refuse treatment. What the person intends in refusing treatment is not necessarily the ending of his or her life, but the ending or impending of a medical treatment that is seriously burdensome in some way. Death is a side effect of removing a burdensome treatment that is accepted, not necessarily intended. You know, again, just be patient with me. I'll come back to that. Okay? Be careful, though, how language is used. Often, those who propose active euthanasia or passive euthanasia under ordinary treatment will use the expression serious burden. Look closely at what exactly is a serious burden. Often, it is the life of the patient that is a serious burden, not the medical treatment. And with this, we also mean those around that person. So not just what the person's going through, but what the other people have to put up with in order to still be taking care of that person. And that may not be something that people are going to accept. It may be seen as a serious burden. So be careful. It is never justified to intentionally destroy human life in order to relieve one of a burdensome existence. That is to do evil to achieve good. Our obligation is to make a person as comfortable as possible and reduce pain as much as possible. But we must not eliminate the pain by eliminating the patient. Also, be careful what some call extraordinary treatment. High-tech medical equipment is not necessarily extraordinary treatment. The definition of extraordinary is such that what is ordinary here in Canada might very well be extraordinary in the United States. As circumstances change, so too might the status of medical treatment. So I'll go back to top here about extraordinary treatment. And I'd like to sort of refine this situation that if you were told that you have 6 months to live, um, 2 years might be worth getting the treatment if they can guarantee that you will live 2 years longer. My wife's nephew had lung cancer, and the lung cancer spread to his brain, and so he had lung and brain cancer. And so they had to treat the brain cancer because the effect on the brain led to effects all over his body. And they gave him 6 months to live because it had spread so much. Now he underwent some chemotherapy, some other radiation, some surgery, and um, they said that it would probably not give him much time. Uh, Fortunately for him, he lived 2 years more. So for 2 years, he could put all his situation in order. He had a wife and he had 3 kids and parents and cousins, etc. So he could settle them all down in preparation for the time when he would not be there. So the treatment that he underwent did not completely alter him. But if that period of time was short, if it's, let's say it's going to be only for a month, then you may not want to undergo treatment because the treatment itself might leave you in less than a good situation. So you may be under heavy sedation, you might have side effects, and so in order to spend an extra month, you may not be able to spend much time because you may be under the effects of the drugs or the illness. So some people have a right to refuse this type of extraordinary treatment because the extra month is not worth missing the 6 months that you were given. And I know some people who refuse the treatment because they'd rather treat their condition with medication, but at least they were alert and conscious and could spend the time with them. Going back to my mother-in-law, the last 2 months, she was hardly with us because every time we visited, she would say hello, give a hug and kiss, happy to see us, and then doze off into a sleep. Um, Similar to I had a very good friend who had brain cancer and a tumor, and the last 3 months that I visited her, because of the amount of morphine to take care of the pain, I went to visit her, but she either was asleep, and if her eyes were open, she recognized me, but she couldn't respond or anything. Eventually, it was just her sleeping all the time. So that's what you have to weigh when you compare ordinary and extraordinary treatment. If it's a surgery that's going to leave you in a wheelchair, for some people that's tolerable. Some athletes may object because they're so used to being athletic and in competition, and being in a wheelchair is not something they want to do. The most famous case is Superman, Christopher Reed, who was riding his horse and got knocked off the horse, landed on his head, and broke his spine from the neck down. So he was in uh, this wheelchair, and they used to call him the Man of Steel, Superman, but he had a lot of contraptions keeping him alive, and he had a machine that, if it was off for 20 minutes, would cause his death. And he continued to live. He lived 10 years after his accident, but in a wheelchair. We'll talk more about him tomorrow as well. So that's the difference between extraordinary and ordinary. So to summarize uh, all this, 2 types of euthanasia. The first one is active euthanasia, and the second one is passive euthanasia. The church teaches that all forms of active euthanasia are unjustified. Passive euthanasia, if it's passive euthanasia and ordinary treatment, then you don't have the right under Catholic teaching to either withhold the treatment or undergo treatment that's ordinary. When it comes to extraordinary treatment, you have a choice of whether you want to take the extraordinary treatment and take the risks associated with it, or not. So of the 4 types of euthanasia, the only one that is permissible under Catholic moral teaching is passive euthanasia and ordinary treatment. Passive euthanasia with extraordinary treatment, no, sorry, my mistake, sorry. Passive euthanasia and extraordinary treatment, you have a choice. Passive euthanasia and ordinary treatment, you should take it. If the operation leaves you in a wheelchair, then it's worth being alive and losing your mobility. All active euthanasia is not acceptable. Okay, so what I have for you to do, and let me, before I go to the cases, let me, go back to this here and see if there's any questions. Okay, so back here, okay, are there any questions about the difference between, let's break up in small pieces, the difference between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia? See if there's any questions about those. Do you understand the difference between active, doing something that causes the death of someone, as opposed to passive, not doing what you should have been doing, which causes the death of the person? No, James, because for some people it becomes such a change in life. If you look up Christopher Reeves, let's see if I can get 1 second, okay? Give me 1 second, please. That's a good question. Okay, just hold on a second. Okay, bear with me. So this is over here, Christopher Reeves. Let's go images here so I can get a better picture. Okay, Christopher Reeves. Let's go this one right here, okay? So this is Christopher Reeves. Okay, also known as Superman. Okay, he starred in the Superman. What happened to my image here? Okay, it's not loading here anyway. Okay, so if you can see this one here. So this is Christopher Reeves when he was a young person. And this is Christopher Reeves when he was acted in Superman. And then after the fall off the horse, these are pictures of Christopher Reeves. So here's a picture. He controlled his wheelchair with this contraption next to his mouth. He still has his hair here. Later on, he started losing his hair. He was married, had a son. And this is Christopher Reeves here after the accident. So he was in this machine. Let's see if I have another one there. Better one right here. Let's see if this will come up. There it is. Okay, so that's Christopher Reeves afterwards, and he's lost a lot of his hair. So he's on this machine, and the back there was an oxygen package, and he was all hooked up. And so basically from his neck down, he was not capable of moving much. And he had some motion in his feet, in his hands. And not once after the fall did he ever think of ending his life. And the reason being is that when he opened his eyes after the fall, he saw the look of his wife's eyes, and his wife looked at him like nothing had happened. So he still saw the love in her eyes. And Christopher Reeves went on to live about 10 more years in this situation here. And he often joked that I'm the man of steel because of all the steel thing that he has here now. And he didn't even want the horse put down. because he said it wasn't the horse's fault that made him flip over, because the horse got spooked by something, maybe a squirrel or something. But he ended up landing on his head and breaking his spinal cord. He couldn't act anymore, but he went back to doing two things that he felt very, or three things that were very important. Number one is being a father and a husband. Number two, he directed a few movies. He went back into his business, which is show business. And he started directing movies. And number three, he presented in the US Congress on more support for people with spinal cord injuries. And especially he went after the insurance companies who want to cut you off after you have spent a certain amount of money from the insurance company. They want to stop helping you. And so he went after the insurance companies to make sure that they don't stop you after a period of 2, 3, 4 years. So when you exhaust your insurance, they say, well, go find some other insurance, and it's really, really expensive. So that's the Man of Steel there. And this is a picture of him as Superman. Okay, here's a better picture. Okay, so what ended up resulting, and this picture with him, his son, and the Man of Steel. And this is when he was younger, and we go on. Okay, so let me end those two. And let's go back here. Okay, I hope I lost it. Okay. It's beautiful. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. And go this one here. Okay, so for James' question, if you have a broken leg, you may spend some time in a wheelchair. So you're willing to use a wheelchair or use some crutches for a while until you heal. With someone who's going to be permanently disabled, and my wife understands that because she had polio when she was 3 years old and she wears braces. That's a different kind of lifestyle. So if you go from being able-bodied to disabled-bodied, for some people it's very hard. You're going to need a lot of counseling and a lot of convincing that life can still go on. In Canada, the best example we have is Rick Hansen, also known as the Man in Motion. And after an accident, he was left paralyzed, and rather than do nothing with his life or collect payments from the government or the insurance companies, he decided to show that even disabled people can be like able people and do marathons. So the Man in Motion, Rick Hansen, wheeled his wheelchair all across the world to show that disabled people, inspired people who are disabled and abled, that your mobility issues do not define who you are as a person. And so that's why being in a wheelchair, wearing crutches or wearing braces for a while, or wearing a cast, it's the price you pay to get better. And if you get in a situation where you're in a wheelchair, it doesn't mean that, oh, I'm going to be in a wheelchair and that now we should think about not being a worthwhile and valuable member of society. Okay, James? But excellent question, thank you. No, ending up in a wheelchair is not extraordinary. It may seem like wheelchair from being an athlete or able-bodied to a wheelchair, but doesn't mean that you can't live a productive life. It doesn't mean you can't be a valuable member of society. It means that you're going to have some mobility issues. Most people, as we age, are going to go and use some type of device. There's an old myth, what creature walks on 4 legs when it's young, walks on 2 legs when it's no, walks on 4 legs after birth, walks on 2 legs most of his life, and then towards of his life walks on 3 legs. And the answer to that riddle or myth is a human being. So when you're born, you walk on all 4s, you crawl. When you're mature enough at around 10, 11 months, you're walking on 2 feet. And if you live a healthy life, you have you use 2 feet to get around. if you're able-bodied, but towards the end of life, you may need the use of a cane. That's your third leg. Okay, that's part of life. Okay, James, but good questions. We're going to revisit those questions after we look at those issues. So we have a bunch of questions here. But good questions, James. Thank you very much. Being in a wheelchair is ordinary treatment. So you don't end your life because you're going to have mobility issues. Euthanasia homework, Louisa, okay, for everyone, you don't, I'd like you to hand it in today at the latest, 8:30 tomorrow morning. So it's something that I want you to hand in. It's out of 5, so you get 1 mark for each. And this is your last communication assignment. And after today's communication assignment, then you have 1 more journal, which we might do tomorrow or Thursday, and then I'll have no more assessments for you. We're just going to do small little things in class. So James, so you're saying that ending up in a wheelchair is not a serious physical burden and is an ordinary treatment? Yes, absolutely. Because especially we have all kinds of mobility devices. You can have a wheelchair, you can have an electric wheelchair. You even have wheelchairs these days that can lift you up. We have scooters, we have electrical scooters. My wife, as she's getting older, she's going through what's called post-polio syndrome. And so she uses a scooter at home, and she also has a scooter in the van with what's called a Bruno arm lift. So she can lift a scooter from the van, take it out, and gives her freedom, gives her mobility. She could travel on her own. When my kids were small and we had soccer games, all the other kids used to jump on my wife, and she used to have 3 or 4 other kids from the soccer teams riding with her on her scooter. So mobility issues are not, yeah, they're important, but you can overcome them. Okay? It is a burden, yeah, it is difficult, it is a challenge, but not something that you can overcome, especially with today's technology. It's still considered ordinary treatment. If you have a broken leg, you're willing to use a crutch for a period of time. If you have to use a crutch all the time, they have those crutches, double crutches where you put on along your elbows as well, and some people have to walk with those. Unfortunately, my wife has to wear braces all the time, and she's had issues since she was 3 years old. Yeah, you have mobility challenges, but you're alive and you can function. Okay? I spent 6 years working in housekeeping in a hospital when I was 16. My father was a cleaner in a hospital. I got a job at the hospital, and it was the best education I had in my life. And I was 16 years old, and I went to clean this one room, and I was working in the neurosurgery ward. And a young girl, 19 years old, had a full scholarship to U of T, and she was involved in a car accident, and she was paralyzed from the waist down. So when I walked into her, they had these 2 metal prongs screwed into her skull, and they would flip her sometimes looking straight up, and sometimes looking straight down. So when she's facing down, I could talk to her with a little mirror she had, so I can see her. And I saw her in that room, and I'd often spend 10, 15 minutes talking to her. And she was 19 years old, full scholarship at U of T, her whole future ahead of herself, but now is going to be paralyzed. And not once in the, I think, 3-5 months that I spoke to her in that ward, was she ever sad? Was she ever upset or angry? And the thing that I learned from her, and this is what I mean by valuable education, she said to me that, yes, I was in a car accident, but God left my mind free to be used, and I'm able to think clearly. I have some use of my arms. Not everything in my body has been taken away from me. And so she said to me, for some reason, God has a purpose for me, and I don't know what it is yet, but I can still contribute, and I can still do something and be something. So your mobility is something you might have to overcome, and we have technology that will help you. But you're live, and that's excellent point. So thank you very much. Michelle, absolutely. This is a crucial question. What about the burden on others? And so that's where you have to be very, very careful when we look at euthanasia, between the burden that you're going to experience and the burden of those people who are around you, who may become your caregivers, or what we might call those who love us. And is it the issue of what they're going through, or is it what you're going through that's a problem? It all depends on what your relationship is and what you mean by love. So, excellent question, Michelle. Thank you. And we'll we'll pick up on that tomorrow when we do the assignments. No, Ben, it's not a chart mark. I just want you to answer the questions on a separate piece of paper. If you can put them together, that's fine. But all I want you to do is answer, is this justified or not? But what's important here is that you explain everything you've learned. uh, Explain why you say that this is justified or not justified. Just saying justified is not going to do it this time, okay? Even though that's what it says there, and I was clear in my instructions, and I want you to explain. Use whatever you want to explain. Spend some time, think about this, um, um, but be very careful. This what we're getting into right now is a very sensitive, very serious topic, and we can have some guidelines about what is justified and what is not justified, but there's always going to be a personal issue here that not everybody's going to be happy with. And ultimately, what it comes down to is a person's own personal choice following their conscience. But we have to make sure that that choice is their own choice. There's no coercion involved, and that conscious is informed, that you actually really know what's going on here. And this is why, in the area of patient rights, it's so crucial for a patient to know everything that's happening so they can make the decision, and not be coerced by family or friends, and not be coerced by medical personnel, nurses, doctors, psychologists, sociologists. Okay, this is a very personal matter. Everyone will see it differently. Everyone will handle it differently, and every two cases will be different. You may have general ideas, but everyone's going to have a special case here. So we're just going to touch briefly on this. If you're interested, next year, take a bioethics course, and you'll dwell more into these cases. Okay. So for Ben's question, it's not a chart mark. It's a mark out of 5, 1 mark for each of your answers. And what I'm asking you to do is look at the notes I gave you, identify whether it is extraordinary or ordinary, and identify whether the treatment is, no, sorry, whether it's active or passive euthanasia, and identify whether it is ordinary or extraordinary treatment. And then from there, say, yes, it's justified, or no, it's not justified, but be prepared to explain your answer. Okay? As in, yes, you can. Okay? Yeah, my apologies, Azine. A lot of students in the class, English is not your second language, and I don't want to put time constraints on you. So for both the journal and for the euthanasia chart, if you need more time to formulate your answers, I respect that tremendously. I have no problems with that. So if you need more time, but please, I like the answers all sent to me by 8:30 tomorrow morning. Because when I come to class, school at 8:30 in the morning, I'll print out the charts, I'll read your journals, and I can finish it before we come to class. I also will figure out what you got out of it and not got out of it, so I can correct it or approve everything you figured out, okay? So Zine, you're okay. Michelle, do you want us to rewrite the, no, you don't have to rewrite the questions. Just give your answers on a piece of paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and please just explain your answers using the vocabulary that I provided for you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, just write it on a, separate piece of paper. Okay, Michelle, good question. Um, Amy asks, is it okay if I can send my chart by the end? Um, I'm going to give you, it's now 2 o'clock, Amy. If you can finish it by the end of the period, great. If you need tonight, great. And if something else has happened, because I'm sure you have other assignments like CPT still due. If you need more time, by all means. I always give people time. Oh, yeah, if you get it finished today before class is over, great. If you need more time, that's okay. Okay. Michelle, if euthanasia depends on the patient's burden, is that not a relative state? Okay, and this is where everything we covered in class is going to start to play here. It's what you mean by a burden, who's experiencing the burden, and who's making the decision. And is it for the good of the patient, or is it of the good of those around the patient? So there is a tendency towards making these kind of decisions very individualistic and relativistic. And so anything goes. And unfortunately, that also includes those around the person. And this is why I say that the person should have an informed consent. And by informed consent, it should be a freely chosen decision without coercion and knowing all the facts. And there should be no pressure put on them by those around them. In Christopher Reeve's situation, what kept him alive and what kept him hopeful is the look on his wife's eyes, the look in his wife's eyes, that uh, she did not display any type of pity or sadness, um, just joy, happiness, and love. And you can't fool the eyes. And what he saw in her eyes was sincerity and love, and that allowed him to to have hope. That even in a situation being in a wheelchair with little function below the neck, that he could still have a life, and with his wife and his son. So that's important. And Michelle, what you raise in terms of relativism, that's the danger, that it becomes simply a moral relativistic position, and anybody can do anything, including those around. And so what you have to be careful of is that you always respect the individual situation and the individual person, and that whatever decision they come to is according to what we call patient rights and informed consent. And informed means you have to understand it totally, and you can't withhold any information, and you can't put any pressure. Yeah, so relatives is not something there. So this is why the Catholic Church has certain guidelines to help us. It doesn't mean people are going to follow them. It doesn't mean people are not going to pressure people, especially when it becomes hard for them to take care of them. It's much easier to get rid of them or to put them away somewhere rather than deal with them. That's a result of what we call an inefficient situation, where we talk about our society is based on efficiency. When you're of use, everybody loves you. When you're no longer of use, it's best to tuck you away, put you away, and even possibly get rid of you. It's a lot easier for us. We can save a lot of money. We can save hospital beds. This is one of the tragic situations with COVID. In Europe, a few months ago, in Italy, France, Spain, and England, they had some serious ethical decisions to make. If you have one ventilator and you have a 70-year-old person needing a ventilator and you have a 30-year-old person needing a ventilator, who gets to use the ventilator to live? Okay, we'll talk about it tomorrow. Michelle, now got that. Nolan, are we allowed to? Yeah, please, you can type it. Thank you, Nolan. Yeah, you can type those answers. Just one page Word document, send it back to me. Yeah, so I want you to work on it now and be very careful. Yeah, so we have lots of time today. What I'm planning to do is not give you any homework. What? Can I give you some homework? No, that's all I gave you, right? Uh, Let me double check this. Sorry, guys. That's it.